Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. I hope you guys can all hear me. I'm gonna slowly get things started. So this is my first time doing a webinar, but I think we can work through this. So I am Lenny Ramsey. I am a QT2 coach as well as a pro athlete coached by QT2. But my background is that I'm a neuroscientist. I have a PhD in neuroscience focusing on stroke recovery. I currently am in Houston, where I just started a job at UT Health, working in a lab that looks at how language is processed in the brain. But as an athlete and as a coach, I have an interest in exercise as well. So that's why I'm doing this webinar today on exercise and the brain. And so I'm going to kind of talk about how exercise influences the brain. All right. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Also, there should be some time at the end where I can ask questions through the chat box or through the questions box, so feel free. All right. So in a general sense, we know that exercise is healthy. It changes your physiology, it decreases obesity, it decreases your chances of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all kinds of other things. And we've known this for a very long time. Even Hippocrates back in the day said that eating alone will not keep a man well. He must also take exercise for food and exercise while possessing opposite qualities, yet work together to promote health. So this is something we've known forever. But I think it's more recent that we've kind of started on focusing on more of the kind of effects on the brain, and with that, the effects on cognition and memory and mood, and that side of things when we talk about the effects of exercise. So inactivity generally, so just being inactive, is a key player in many unhealthy conditions, and I think that's not news to anybody. This is from a review that kind of looked at what all is influenced by being inactive. But I think the one thing I want to highlight here is just the nervous system. So the nervous system is affected, and with that, cognitive dysfunction, depression, and anxiety rise as people are inactive. For example, if we think about American school system, there's about 30% of kids that are obese at this point. And this doesn't only cause health issues, it also causes a higher likelihood of emotional and social issues. And with that, you can kind of think of maybe, being teased or anything like that, but you can also think it from the other side. There's actually more to it. Because if you kind of zoom in on IQ scores, this was a study in which they compared siblings, of which one was normal weight and the other was within the obese range, so 150% of ideal weight. And you actually see a higher IQ in kids and adults that are normal weight versus ones that are overweight. So there's actually more at play. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what exercise does for the brain. But I want to say that in many ways, the brain is similar to muscle in that mild stress causes growth. It's what you do with training and muscles as well, right? So you cause some damage, but it also causes growth. You cause some inflammation, but with that, you also grow stronger. You do have to put an effort to cause this growth. If you just go to the gym and without weight, make a few movements and leave. Yes, you've moved, but you haven't actually put any effort in, and you actually won't see any muscle growth. So you have to put an effort to cause growth, and that's the same with the brain in every possible way. But too much stress is detrimental. So that's there's always the flip side to it. Right? So normal exercise is good, overtraining is not. And it's the same with mental stimulation. Cognitive stimulation is good, but excessive stress and psychosocial stress is detrimental. So there's always that balance between the two. So what I'm kind of going to go over is some basics of the brain, and that's just so you kind of have an understanding of what I'm talking about when I go into the rest of the presentation. Then I'll talk a little bit about how exercise specifically influences the brain, and then how this relates back to cognition. And then finally, I'll kind of touch briefly on a little bit on how exercise has been shown to help with disease states. So the brain. So we have the central nerve, whole nervous system. You can see here in the body, you have the nerves, which is your peripheral nervous system, and you have your spinal cord and the brain. Today, I'm mostly going to focus on the brain part, though some of it also actually applies to the rest of the nervous system. So if you zoom in on the brain can be divided into all these different parts. Those are called lobes. Every lobe kind of has its own function. The occipital lobe is important for vision, but here is highlighted is the postcentral gyrus and the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is where your motor control kind of comes from. The postcentral gyrus is where most of our somatosensory comes from. So that's where how we feel things in our body. The frontal lobe is important because that's the part of the brain that is very well developed in humans, not so much in other animals. So that's where a lot of our emotion and memory and stuff like that is stored. Long-term memory, however, is kind of part of this temporal lobe here on the side. That's where the key area of the hippocampus is, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The ability to focus and shift your attention and focus on, for example, what you're reading or what you're listening to, that is guided through this parietal lobe up here. So that's kind of to show that it's all very widespread. There's always this idea of we don't use all of our brain. That's not really true. We kind of do use all of it, but it's like a constant communication between all of these different areas in the brain. And the way that works is that the brain itself consists of neurons. So all of this on the outside of the brain here is over 100 billion of these neurons. They come in different shapes and sizes. This is kind of a typical one. So you have a cell body that's kind of with the nucleus, so that's kind of the control center. And then you have an axon, and that's how, through that axon, it sends communication to other neurons. So that axon is kind of a highway or a connection between one neuron to the next. And then if we zoom in a little bit more on the end of that axon, on the end of that highway. So here, this is how one neuron kind of connects to the next neuron, and that is called the synapse. And what happens is it sends an electrical signal through that axon, which then lands on to that synapse, and the synapse then releases what are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are endogenous chemicals. That just means that these are chemicals that are created by the body, in the body. So those are released into what's called the synaptic cleft, but the important part is that they're released here and that they then cause a change in the neuron of the other side. And that neuron on the other side is then either activated or deactivated. And this is a process that there's hundreds of connections with every neuron. So this is a process that's kind of constantly ongoing all throughout the brain. Some of the common neurotransmitters are listed right here, and you might have heard of some of them. For example, the endorphins, endocannabinoids. So those are cannabinoids that are made by the body itself. Dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, acetylcholine, GABA, glutamate. So these are all neurotransmitters that are very common in the brain. And some neurotransmitters are very widespread, whereas other neurotransmitters are kind of limited to a specific area in the brain. All right. So that's kind of how it all works. But that all kind of leads to what I want to talk about a little bit more, and that is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means the lifelong ability of the brain to change, reorganize, and adapt. This is key for anything that we do. Our brain has to change for us to be able to make new memories, learn new skills, or anything like that. This can be seen during development, obviously, when you're talking the very early development of the brain, and through childhood, all these changes, there are large amounts of change is happening at that point. But this also is seen during learning as adult. As I said, anything, any interactions, any memories you make, that means that something is changing in the brain. And this is kind of heightened also, again, if there is damage in the brain that kind of needs to be repaired. There's a very limited amount of repair that can occur, but some repair does occur. Children have an enhanced capacity for neuroplasticity. It's, for example, kids, when they learn at a very high speed, they learn tons of new things. They're also still growing. But they also, for example, have a higher capacity, or it's easier for them to learn a new language, for example. And that's much harder if you don't start that until you're an adult. But even in adult, the brain is still constantly changing. It's just kind of a protective mechanism that it doesn't change too much, because if it changes too much, that means that you could lose things that you already had. So it's a little bit more limited, but the brain is still constantly changing. An example of this is a study in which they looked at if they could teach people how to juggle. And these were adults, 24 students that they taught how to juggle. And you can use MRI to get images of the brain. And what they did is they took images of the brain before they started juggling, then after a month of practicing juggling, and then again 3 months later when they had stopped juggling. And what you can see is the highlighted area is an area that is important for hand-eye coordination, which is very important when you're trying to learn how to juggle. And then in this little graph to the side here, you can see that this is they've kind of set a baseline for the size of that area. And then after training, that area was actually increased in size. And then 3 months later, even though people hadn't juggled, so they actually were almost back to baseline in terms of their ability to juggle, that area was still slightly enlarged. And over time, that will, if you don't juggle anymore, that will slowly decrease and go back to baseline. But that does show that there is a lasting change in the brain when you actually learn something in areas that are relevant for that skill. So the brain doesn't change everywhere. It's just areas that are kind of relevant and being used also kind of expand. Again, that's very similar to muscles. If you're training a specific muscle, with weightlifting, you don't necessarily see muscle expansion or increased muscle everywhere. You just see it where you're training it. So basically what happens with neuroplasticity is that you have experiences, and that causes changes in activity, and that's mostly mediated by the neurotransmitters that I mentioned before. So there more neurotransmitters can be released, other types of neurotransmitters can be released, that kind of stuff. This then causes or leads to an enhancement of connections, and that's called LTP and LTD, which is long-term potentiation and depression, which is just a key factor in memory formation. And that just means that connections that already exist are being strengthened or weakened. And then the next step is the formation of new connections. So neurons can form new connections with each other. So you can kind of see that here at the bottom. So every red dot is a connection of a neuron coming onto this neuron. And here you see that there's many more red dots. It just means that more connections are formed. So that means that if one neuron is active, it can send a much stronger signal over to the next neuron. And then the final kind of step here is new neurons forming, so neurogenesis. For a long time, it was thought that new neurons couldn't form in the brain, and that's not completely true. It doesn't happen everywhere, but in some key regions that have to do with memory formation, we do actually see what's called neurogenesis, and that's the formation of new neurons. So kind of these steps here on the left, those are faster, these are slower, this takes more time. And that also means that these changes can happen and quickly, but they are short lasting, whereas changes in actual neurons are more permanent. I say more permanent because there's always change happening. So it's a use it or lose it. So if you grow something, or like muscle, again, if you grow it, but then stop using it, it will eventually go away. So then what does exercise actually do in the brain? Well, there are widespread changes, and I'm going to focus in a little bit on the cerebral blood flow, the neurotransmitter system, so those are kind of those chemicals that I just mentioned, and the neuroplasticity. In terms of cerebral blood flow, so cerebral blood flow just means that the blood that goes to and through the brain. Blood flow, of course, brings nutrients to the brain. It also takes away any waste products. So this is a key element of the whole body, but especially in the brain, where that balance is super important. And so it's a very highly regulated system. Exercise increases blood flow. In general, throughout the body, it increases blood flow. In the brain, again, this is a little bit more regulated. The brain can't handle crazy amounts of blood flow going at high rates. But it kind of mediates where blood flow goes, where that increase in blood flow goes, and that actually goes to key areas that are important, for example, for motor control, but also for things like memory and cognition, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. For these areas, that means that we get increased oxygen, increased glucose, and those are things that all cells in the body, but also especially neurons, need to function properly. Exercise also improves vasculature. So if you look at the blood vessel at the bottom, you just have a blood vessel and then you have branching. And exercise actually increases the amount of branching. This amount of branching is important because that means that nutrients can easier get to all the different neurons. So that's a good thing. That increases what we call neuronal survival. As we age, after you're somewhere in your 20s, we start actually our amounts of neurons start decreasing, and this kind of counteracts that. So it actually keeps neurons alive longer, which means that we have more neurons to work with for a longer period of our life, which is a good thing. All right, so the neurotransmitter systems. So I mentioned quite a few neurotransmitters, and actually there's also quite a few of them that are influenced by exercise. We, for example, see an increase in norepinephrine release. Norepinephrine is really important for arousal, attention, energy, sleep, and self-esteem. So those are some of the key features that are influenced by norepinephrine. Another one is dopamine. We get an increase in dopamine synthesis. So dopamine is actually created in the brain. And when we have more of it, that means that more can be transferred from one neuron to the next. And this dopamine is very important. It's very abundant in our motor system, generally for motor control, but it is also very important in terms of our reward system, so that we feel pleasure after doing something, for example, exercise and staying motivated. There's an increase in serotonin. Serotonin is important for mood regulation and also things like impulse control and, again, self-esteem. And I'll touch again back on this later, but serotonin is actually one of the key players in depression as well. If you've ever heard of SSRIs, those are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So those keep serotonin in the brain longer, and that helps against depression. So serotonin is a key player there, but it's a key player in all of us in terms of mood regulation and impulse control. And we see an increase of that due to exercise. Then there's the glutamatergic system. Glutamate is one of the most abundant neurotransmitters in the brain. It's actually present kind of pretty much everywhere in the brain. And exercise increases what are called NMDA receptors. And the key to take away from that is that that strengthens connections between neurons. And that is very important for memory formation. Some other ones, endorphins. You've probably all heard of endorphins. These are increased during exercise, but also after exercise. These make you kind of feel good. They actually release dopamine. And if you remember in the previous slide, I mentioned dopamine as being important for reward and pleasure. So that's kind of how those are related. So endorphins help release that dopamine, make you feel good after exercise, and kind of gives you sort of a reward response. It also reduces pain signaling. There's this substance or a neurotransmitter called substance P, which is related for pain signaling. So it signals pain from the body to the brain, and endorphins actually kind of block that so that you don't feel as much pain. And then there are endocannabinoids. So these are many drugs that we use in daily life, recreational or not, right? They have to work with our nervous system as is. So that means that there are generally also endogenous components, so the components that the body creates itself that work on these systems. So endocannabinoids are neurotransmitters that work on the cannabinoid system. They're kind of interesting. They're a little bit weird. So normally, as I kind of showed earlier, a neuron sends a signal, then releases the neurotransmitter onto what we call a postsynaptic neuron, so onto the next neuron. Endocannabinoids are weird in that they are released from kind of backwards. So they come from the second neuron and they kind of move back towards the first neuron. But it helps balance and calm the system. If there's a bunch of activity coming through, it kind of sends a signal backwards that says, calm down, chill out. And this system is important and kind of helps out with memory, appetite, stress, anxiety, sleep, and pain, which are kind of all things that you can probably relate to THC use or smoking weed or something like that. Those are kind of things that play a role there. So you can overshoot, for example, with the memory. But all of that's kind of where the endocannabinoids are important, and they help with stress relief and that kind of stuff in terms of exercise. They also are thought to help with neuronal survival, but that's still kind of a newer topic. So these are general changes. They all kind of influence the brain as is, but all of these also result in some form of neuroplasticity. And BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is a growth factor. And a growth factor just means that this is a key player in initial brain development, but then also in adult, and it's important for formation of neuronal connections, for general neuronal survival, for neurogenesis, and changes in the vasculature. So it's really widespread, and increases of it are generally good for the brain. It makes the brain a little bit more flexible, and it keeps the brain healthy longer. So BDNF is really important there. And it's been shown pretty clearly both in animals and somewhat in humans that it's actually increased through aerobic exercise. Strength training so far has not shown the same results, so it seems to be something with aerobic exercise that actually causes this. I think something that's really interesting here is that it can directly come from the brain. So if you actually start working out, you'll actually see changes in the brain, blood flow, neurotransmitters, and that also causes the release of more of this BDNF, so of this growth factor. But what also happens is when you use your muscles, the muscles also release some of this growth factor, and this then goes through the bloodstream to the brain. So from muscle activity, you actually get some of this as well that then flows to the brain. So it's not just coming from the brain, it's coming from the body and the muscle activity as well. So muscles can act as endocrine organs. So they release stuff that then goes to the brain and increases kind of like all of these mechanisms in the brain. Lactate also contributes to brain metabolism. So increased lactate due to higher intensity exercise also causes increase in BDNF in the brain, and with that neuronal survival. So there is a relationship with lactate. I don't think we have a full understanding of how it works, other than the fact that it does work, and that's kind of important in terms of neuronal survival. And also, as I mentioned, the synaptogenesis and the neurogenesis. So the creation of more connections between neurons, as well as the creation of new neurons, which all is important for creating new memories and learning new things. These BDNF levels peak about 10 to 20 minutes after moderate continuous exercise. So this is where learning seems to be improved. So what does this actually mean in practice? So there's this very interesting case where there's a Naperville high school, Naperville Central High in Chicago, and they ran into a problem where they had remedial teaching that overlapped for some students with their PE class, but they had a requirement of all students taking their PE class, so they added what they called a 0-hour PE program. So the students came into class earlier, did their PE early morning, and then went to remedial teaching before they went to their actual normal, the rest of their day program. And when they compared the reading scores of the students that had this 0-hour PE to the students that also had remedial teaching that did not have that 0-hour PE right before it, they just had different schedules, they actually saw an increased improvement in reading in the students that had the 0-hour PE right before. So you can see that in this figure here. So this is change in grade level due to the remedial teaching. And you see that there's a larger improvement in the light blue bars. And this across 2 different years, school years. But there's a larger increase with students that had that PE right before their remedial teaching. They then also tested this with algebra, and they actually saw even larger improvements there. There are now other schools that have also tried this. They call it learning readiness PE, and the idea is that you put their physical exercise for the students before their most difficult classes or before any remedial teaching that they might be doing, and you actually see an improved benefit. So this was kind of not a planned study. This was something that just kind of happened to be found. And I think that's a good example of where we are right now in terms of starting to see that these things are very beneficial. To kind of think about when you plan your exercise, especially when we're talking about kids that are learning. But these benefits of exercise are seen for all ages, for healthy people, for mentally impaired, for physically impaired, doesn't matter. Directly after exercise, you actually see an improvement in your mental capacity, basically. This is likely due to changes in blood flow, changes in those neurotransmitters that are released, and all of this causes an improvement in attention. So your ability to focus is better, and that's not just because you're maybe more awake. It's actually because there's a bunch of neurotransmitters and things that have changed in the brain that make you more ready to learn and to kind of take in whatever you need to focus in. So it also improves your executive functioning, which has a lot to do with basically everything of mental skills, memory, self-control, all that kind of stuff, as well as mood. Some other things that also have kind of been shown to improve are things like sleep and self-esteem. So what about long-term effects? Because this is directly after exercise. Well, so exercise in general causes an increase in blood flow and an increase in neurogenesis. So that's kind of what I mentioned before. This shows an improved memory performance. And the interesting thing here is that this is a study in mice. So in humans, it's really hard to look at single neurons, but we can do that kind of stuff in mice and rats. In this study, basically they had control mice. So these were mice that did not do anything at all. They just lived in a normal cage. They had mice that they trained on what's called the Morse water maze, which is a task in which they are put in the water and they have to find a platform that they can't see. The first time they'll search, but then the more they do it, the easier they'll find the platform. They'll remember where it is. So it's a memory task. So this is very much focused on memory. And then the third group was a wheel running group. They just ran on a wheel, so an exercise group basically. And the black dots that you can see, those are actually new neurons in what we call the hippocampus, the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, which is an area that is key for memory formation. That's where new memories are formed and solidified. So that's where one of the areas where we see the most effect, the highest effect of BDNF and the highest effect or the highest number of new neurons being formed. And what you can see here is that wheel running actually caused the largest increase in cells, even more so than just a memory task, even though this is a memory region and not a region that is related to exercise in any other way. So that's, I think that's very interesting to kind of show that. And this also is related to improved memory in mice and rats as well. And we see that in humans in a different way. So again, in humans, we can't look at single cells, but we can look at the size of brain areas. And so you can use MRI to measure the size of the hippocampus. And the hippocampus, again, is that key memory region. When we do that, and they took 2 groups in this study, and one group, they did regular stretching exercises multiple times a week, whereas the other group did exercise. They went through an exercise program, aerobic exercise program, multiple times a week. And they started at baseline. They started off having a similar size hippocampus. There's a small difference here, but that's not significant. And then they measured the size of the hippocampus again after 6 months, and then finally after 1 year. And you can see that kind of not doing anything or stretching, but it's kind of somewhat sedentary. You see a decline in the size of the hippocampus, which everybody over, as you age, you'll see somewhat of a decline. But with the exercise group, you actually saw an increase in the size of the hippocampus. And this, again, was linked to improvements in memory. So with exercise in the long term, and we're talking about aerobic exercise here, so consistent aerobic exercise, we see improvements in executive functions. So that's your ability to direct your attention to places. That's your ability to inhibit actions and just general memory functions, but also things like attention and just general overall cognitive performance. And here on the right, for example, they did a study on a large group of young, healthy adults. And at the bottom, they took their VO2 max and they correlated that with their memory. You see that there's a positive correlation. This basically means that the people with a higher VO2 max also had a better memory performance. All of this is likely due to improved blood flow of key areas. So one of them is that memory area, the hippocampus, but there are some others as well. And then changes in connections between neurons. So there's an increased strengthening of connections and some weakening as well. So that's for connections to be able to strengthen, others need to weaken. So it's kind of a higher turnover of those connections, which is key for normal functioning. We see an increased number of neurons, and as I just showed with that increased size of the hippocampus, and overall just an increased neuroplasticity. And these are all good things because these are all things that decline as we age. But the longer this stays, the longer we stay active and the brain kind of stays flexible, the better it is for us in terms of performance now, but also in the future. The strongest evidence for these results is for aerobic training. There is some for resistance training, not a whole lot. Aerobic training seems to do the most. These effects are also the strongest in kids and in older adults. Kind of when you're in the prime of your life, you still see effects, but they're not as strong as that we see them kind of at either end of the spectrum. And they're the best for consistent long-term exercise. So being consistent and kind of building up that fitness. So overall, we see short and long-term benefits for all ages, genders, and backgrounds, etc. But do keep in mind, so this is a graph showing cognitive ability on the y-axis. So this is your cognitive ability, and this is exercise intensity and duration. So from like mild to moderate amounts of exercise or effort, you see an increase in your cognitive ability. So that's kind of optimal. If you overdo it and go into excessive fatigue, the fatigue will counteract the positive benefits of your exercise. So if you go very intense, very high for high intensity or very long, and you go into that point where you're too fatigued to then be able to function cognitively, then that kind of counteracts any effects. So you have to kind of find that balance, and that might be different for different people. Aging and exercise and cognition. I think this is kind of flows naturally from what I've already talked about. There was a very large study done by Colcomb and Kramer in 2003, so it's a little bit older, but I think it was very well done in that they did a meta-analysis, which meant that they looked at all the different research that was out there. So they found all the different studies and they kind of pulled all the information together. And they looked at people that were over 55 in age. And what they found is that general fitness, so being physically active and exercising on a regular basis, improves executive control, inhibition, memory, and speed in older adults. The largest effects were seen when people did consistent aerobic training combined with some strength work. If the sessions of aerobic training were at least 30 minutes in duration. They actually saw stronger effects in females than men. We don't have a clear understanding of why, but there was a larger effect there. They saw increased effects with increased age. So they saw larger effects for over 65 than between 55 and 65. So I think for aging, this is important in terms that, you can start at any age becoming fit, but you will see long-lasting effects. Because the healthier and more active the brain is throughout life, you kind of build up a buffer for cognitive decline. Cognitive decline is due to kind of the decrease in flexible flat vasculature, so you lose some of those little blood vessels. It's a decrease in turnover of connections, so everything becomes a little bit more stiff. You don't see as much neurogenesis, so not as many new neurons are formed, and you actually see more neuronal death. So generally throughout life, we lose neurons. Neurons kind of die off over time. And we don't really replenish them as quickly. So with aging, that always will happen, but you can counteract some of that through exercise. And so it keeps the brain plastic and active longer, and with that, you kind of build up a buffer for any decline that might happen. And as we kind of all know, it decreases the chance of many conditions, but it also postpones and slows down the decline associated with many conditions. So even if you do develop Parkinson's or dementia, you can actually kind of slow down those effects through exercise. And here, this is in a study done in people that were 70 years or older, and they compared people that were high in physical fitness and low in physical fitness. And there's a small difference here, but you can definitely see in the group of people that were identified as having dementia that if you measure their just general cognitive functioning, that the high physical fitness group overall did better than the low physical fitness group. So again, that has related to the kind of like building up that buffer for cognitive decline. So you kind of keep your brain more plastic longer and kind of prevent the decline a little bit longer. So finally, I do want to touch briefly on exercise and disease. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. I think maybe at some point I'll do another webinar on this because I think there's a lot to talk about here, but I just want to briefly touch on a couple points. Exercise has many positive effects in general in terms of mood. So in general, if you look at different studies that are out there, exercisers are less anxious, less depressed, less neurotic, more outgoing, less stressed, less angry. I mean, I'm sure this isn't the case for everybody, but I think in general, across the board, this is what you'll kind of find. So here are some figures that kind of show exercise. So this is no exercise after 10 minutes of exercise, after 20 minutes of exercise, and after 30 minutes of exercise, and then the change. So 0 is kind of baseline, that's no change. And then so you see a decrease in depressed mood, you see a slight decrease in tension, you see a slight decrease in overall fatigue. So these are just some of the positive effects, again, of exercise. There is quite some evidence now out there. Again, this is somewhat newer still. It's from the last few years where it's becoming very clear that you can actually use exercise as a treatment for things like depression and anxiety, for ADHD and Alzheimer's disease. There's also shown a lot of evidence now to show that there is an improvement in cases of Parkinson's disease, stroke, which is kind of my background. So at some point, maybe I'll do in a webinar, I'll talk more about that as well. But also schizophrenia, MS, and addiction. But I won't really touch on those right now. I'm just going to briefly touch on the first three. So I think this was kind of a key study where they looked at patients with depression, and they divided them up into 3 groups. One was a medication group. So these are patients that were just diagnosed with depression. And so they're divided up in a medication group, an exercise group, and a combination between the two. The graph on the left and on the right are the same patients. They're just 2 different measures of depression, the Hamilton Depression Score and the Beck Depression Inventory. So what it shows is that the white bars are after treatment, the dark bars are before treatment, and so higher scores generally are worse. And what this shows is that basically there were equal effects of medication, exercise, and the combination of the 2. If you looked a little bit more closely at the results in the studies, they show that the antidepressants work a little bit more quickly. So within the first few weeks, you actually see that the that the medication group does the best. But after 6 weeks and later, after the first few months, I would say after 3 to 4 months, you actually see that they're all pretty much the same. And all of these differences are statistically significant. So you actually see statistically significant improvements for any of these options. And the medication does not necessarily do better than the exercise or vice versa. They actually kind of end up doing very similarly. Moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise under the supervision of a professional have the greatest effect. And part of the being under the supervision of a professional is just that it's done in a healthy way, and it also kind of leads to accountability. With that, you get consistency. And doing group activities adds a positive social component. And I think you've probably all experienced that that things can just be more enjoyable if you have a partner to do it with. And so doing group activities adds a positive social component, which for people that struggle with depression can actually be a benefit on its own. And in this case, because you do the exercise and have the social component, it kind of adds on to each other, so you actually can strengthen the effects of the exercise. So just the changes that are thought to be involved here. Endorphins, obviously they make you feel better, but generally neurotransmitters. As I mentioned the serotonin, and then there's also the norepinephrine. These are neurotransmitters that are increased due to exercise. These are both neurotransmitters that many antidepressants work on. So the SSRIs work on serotonin, but there are also many other antidepressants that work on norepinephrine or a combination of the two. So by exercise and increasing these, you actually do the same as what an antidepressant pretty much would do. If you look at people that have struggled with depression over the long term, you actually see that they have smaller hippocampal volume, which is that memory region that actually decreases in size for people with depression. We don't really understand why. Nobody really knows why and how that's related to the mood, but it's because it's mostly memory, but there is a relationship there. And the increased neurogenesis or formation of new neurons due to exercise can counteract that effect somewhat. And then there's also an involvement of hormones. So I didn't really touch on the hormones, and I'm not going to go into that much more now. But hormones are influenced by exercise, and those can also play a role in terms of things like depression and mood. A side note that I think is just interesting is that there's also this thought that exercise can help decrease anxiety. And because exercise increases your heart rate, so if you increase your heart rate, even through a short burst, you kind of cause a spike in heart rate. Your body realizes that this is not related to a threat. So this is something that's related to something you're doing, but not a threat. And that actually can decrease anxiety. Because if you think about something like anxiety, it works both ways. If you're afraid of something, then your heart rate increases. But the body is interesting in terms of how it's connected. And that also means that if you get an increase in heart rate, your brain can interpret that as anxiety. So if you teach your body that an increase in heart rate is not necessarily related to an external stimulus that you have to be afraid of, you can actually decrease anxiety that way. So doing kind of some short bursts of high intensity exercise can actually help decrease anxiety in daily life. ADHD is another interesting one. Generally, ADHD is caused by an underactivity of the prefrontal cortex. So I think people often think that this is kind of counterintuitive. But the prefrontal cortex is the front of the brain, and that's the part that is very well developed in humans. And it's very important for things like planning, and organizing, and impulse control, and maintaining focus. And if that's underactive, that means that you have more trouble doing any of those things. And that's what you often see in cases of ADHD. Norepinephrine and dopamine are two of the neurotransmitters that are very important here. That's where, for example, the drug Ritalin works. So Ritalin actually causes an increase of the release of those neurotransmitters, which kind of counteracts that underactivity. And we saw earlier that both of those are increased due to exercise. So that then improves memory, improves focus, and improves your ability to plan, so that kind of counteracts all the issues that they have. So it might not fix it all, it might not solve it all, it might not be a perfect solution, but I think keeping it in mind now, especially in a time where ADHD is diagnosed more and more frequently, and I think kids are put on things like Ritalin and other drugs more and more frequently to kind of counteract that. I think if we can kind of create a better situation where we can kind of control it more, at least with things like exercise and sports, I think that's worth focusing on. And here on the right, this figure shows a study on kids with ADHD. So this index score is the working memory, so that's just a memory, they measured memory. And here the first group was an exercise group that just did things like ball handling and dexterity and balance exercises. The second group was a general sports group, so they just played general ball sports and that kind of stuff, no specific focus. And then they had a control group that were waitlisted, so they were waiting to get onto one of the sports, into one of the sports groups. So that's just a control group, so they didn't do anything different. We actually saw an increase in memory scores in both of the exercise groups. So that's just to show that kind of their issues with learning might be counteracted by doing exercise. And just as a side note, doing the exercise or something with like ball handling or dexterity or anything like that, any kinds of sports also helps with motor abilities. And those are often also somewhat underdeveloped in kids with ADHD. Not always, but it kind of is one of the cofactors that often goes hand in hand. And then I wanted to briefly touch on Alzheimer's disease. I think that's goes together with aging and cognitive decline, except in more of an extreme form. In patients with Alzheimer's disease, we see a decrease in that BDNF, so that's that growth factor that helps the brain be flexible. And with that, we see a neurodegeneration, so death of neurons in the hippocampus, which is that memory area, which is probably what causes some of the effects, the big cognitive effects that we see in Alzheimer's disease. And this is that decrease of neurons, or the death of neurons in the hippocampus, is a death of glutamatergic neurons. A beta plaques are kind of one of the main kind of elements that you see in Alzheimer's disease. It's a protein that aggregates in a bad way and then kills neurons, and that causes the cell death of neurons in the hippocampus. And there seems to be decrease in blood flow as well. It's not clear if that's a cause or an effect kind of thing, but it does seem to be involved. But this can all be somewhat counteracted by exercise. It can't be prevented completely, but again, you can create a buffer with more flexible brain, so you can kind of postpone the effects that you see due to Alzheimer's disease, and you can kind of slow it down. So it can work somewhat preventative, and it can slow progression. And I think that, again, is something that's becoming more and more clear. So being active throughout life can help you kind of set you up in a better way as you age. All right, so just to kind of wrap up, generally exercise causes improvement in blood flow, neurotransmitter release, and neuroplasticity overall. With that, you get improved memory, attention, executive functioning. So generally, that leads to improvements in things like school performance or performance at work, or just general your ability to be able to focus on different tasks or people at hand. So in a large scale, just better performance overall. It also helps against the effects of aging, can help with depression, ADHD, and many other disorders. The best results have been shown for moderate aerobic exercise for probably at least 30 minutes and consistency. So doing that a few times a week and then multiple weeks, months, years, whatever it takes, but doing it for longer periods of time. So there is also a direct effect of exercise. So just doing exercise and then doing something after is a good thing. I, for example, like to take my lunch break and go for a run and then get back to work, especially if I'm kind of feeling that little midday slump. And that does help. but there's also many effects that are long-term, just based on long-term, being active long-term. And then finally, I just want to say that you have to love what you do. Being more engaged and leads to better compliance and also better results. It's not, in some studies have kind of shown that if you are aerobically active but do it in a way that you have to be focused, you actually see better effects on the brain than if you mindlessly do your exercises. So be engaged and love what you do. That just make sure that you're able to kind of maintain it and get the best effects out of all of it. So that's what I have for you guys today. So let me know if you have any questions. Bruce asked if there's a difference in the amount of endorphins released during aerobic versus anaerobic efforts. I don't know specifically for endorphins, but if I just kind of group it in with the rest of the neurotransmitters, there is the best evidence for aerobic exercise. There is some for resistance training that it's better than not doing anything, but the best evidence that's out there shows it for aerobic exercise of at least 20 to 30 minutes. That's kind of where we see the largest effects in endorphins as well. I think endorphins are one of those things people say for longer term, and I think at least 30 minutes is probably where you want to be, and that's for most of the effects. I kind of looked, and there's not a whole lot out there on things like high intensity training, like the HIIT stuff. So I think that's something that still needs to be looked at. Also, kind of the specifics of how intense should you go and how long. I think people haven't gotten to the point where they're really starting to tease that apart. But just looking at generally what's out there, it's kind of aerobic exercise of at least 30 minutes for a session. Are there any other questions? All right, I don't see any other questions, so I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Feel free to email me or look me up or send me a message or something like that, either through social media or you can contact me through QT2. If you have any questions or want to know any more about this, there's also a couple books that I could refer you to if you have an interest in these kinds of topics. So feel free to reach out, and thank you for joining me today.